All right, hello and welcome everybody to the webinar. Today we'll be discussing the year-end process and focusing more specifically on the mass renewal utility, and we'll take a look at aligning our service configuration for best practices, making it a bit easier to renew in the future. My name is Mike Bowen, and I'm the Manager of Implementation here at Real Green, and with me today is Chandra Mogensen, one of our amazing implementation specialists, who will be helping with any questions submitted during the webinar. Just a quick reminder that you can submit questions in the webinar panel that should be displayed on your screen now. So to kick things off, we'll talk a little bit about what are renewals here. So renewals allow you to copy over your programs and jobs to active or for active customers from the current or previous season, depending on when we're running them, into the next, eliminating the need to manually add programs and jobs to customers year over year. Right, so that's going to be really what we're doing. So in this example today, we're going to be renewing services for 2021 and copying those programs and jobs into 2022. During this process, any work that's already been completed or was skipped using any skip code besides an N or never do skip code will automatically be changed to a Y or be placed in a status to be done in the following season. This just allows us to prepare to begin work once that season starts. So we'll transition now into getting into the software, and I'm actually going to go ahead and turn the camera off just so that we can make the SA5 view a little bit larger for you. There we go. So let's get signed in, and the first thing we're going to want to take a look at is going to be our year-end checklist. So everything we're going to be looking at today for the renewals part is going to be through utilities. So to access that, we have a couple of different ways. We can get to the utilities by hovering over our three-line menu at the top left if we're using that new navigation style and selecting utilities. If we're still using the classic navigation menu, what we're going to be looking for is the utilities, so the screwdriver and wrench icon here at the top right. It's a little bit different depending on your view there. The other area of the software we're going to look at is going to be under settings. So again, in the classic view, we have the settings gear here at the top right. And then in the new navigation menu, that's just going to be the settings option here. All right, so again, the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be that year-end checklist. So from our utilities, we'll scroll down to our year-end. And the first thing we find is going to be that year-end checklist. Right, so this is going to be really what guides you through the process of completing the renewals, and not just the renewals. There's more to this. This is going to allow you or coach you through adding or running some reports, right? Making sure that everything that was completed in 2021 or the current year is ready to be renewed into the next season. It'll let you take a look at some of the financial information, some of the completed work information. So there's actually a number of reports that this is going to walk you through. And this does serve as a checklist. So as we proceed through this year-end checklist, we can mark things off as being completed. So when we're running a season summary by service report, we can select that before. We've validated this, we've run this before we process renewals. Then after the renewal process, we'll actually go back through this, and then we can mark this as after, and we can see that the color is changing of this item when we make our selection. So red, meaning we haven't done either part of that process before or after. Yellow being we're partway through that element. And then once we select after, it's going to indicate in green that we've completed that checklist item. Again, just a nice way to kind of walk you through that entire year-end process and not just the renewal portion. But if we scroll down a bit further, we can see that we're going to, get into some of the other utilities and things like that. So again, the checklist is going to be your one-stop shop for setting up and preparing for your entire year-end. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is really the renewals best practice configuration. So before we jump into the mass renewals utility, we'll discuss what we here at Real Green consider to be best practices. So to begin, let's quickly review where in the software we will find configurations that impact renewals. So first we'll take a look at a customer's account and then open up that customer's program details page. So again, we'll just jump into an account here, opening up any one of our programs or jobs. And then we can see we have a couple of different elements here. So we have the renewal price and the renewal size, which the renewal size is going to be that size that gets renewed into the next season. More often than not, that is going to be the same as the size we have in the current season. However, there are times where we maybe need to update that because we're not going to provide services to that full property this season, but next season that customer has requested we're going to service the entire property or additional elements of that property. So we might update that renewal size so that everything is renewed correctly there. Right, next is going to be that renewal price. So the price for this season, renewal price being that price that will be applied to the following season. Kind of goes hand in hand there with the renewal size. Generally, if you're going to update that, you're also going to look at updating the renewal price as well. Right, so if we scroll down a little bit further here, the next item we have is going to be our renewed and our auto renew checkbox. So what the auto renew checkbox indicates is whether or not this specific program or job should be renewed as part of running the mass renewals utility. Right, with this box deselected, the utility will not copy over that program or job to the next season. Most commonly, this box is selected by default as configured within our service setup, which we'll take a look at here in a little bit, for special jobs or programs that are to continue season over season, meaning if they have it this year, we plan on performing that service next year unless the customer reaches out and requests that we do not. And that's just what you might hear from Real Green as a continuous service type job. So programs or jobs that are to be provided on an as needed basis generally would not be configured to auto renew. So that's just a service we're going to add on manually as maybe we identify a condition on the property that warrants that job, or it's something the customer is going to reach out and request. All right, and then the renewed checkbox is going to be selected automatically once we process our renewals. So using that mass renewal utility, when we renew our jobs from 2021 into 2022, we can come back and we'll see that that job is marked as renewed once it's finished. So now we're going to kind of get into those best practices and realigning with what we consider those to be. So if you had previously not configured continuous service programs and special jobs to be auto renew, not a big deal, don't worry about it. We can help you get back on track. And once we do that this season, we'll find that it'll make the next season's renewals that much easier. Right, so we'll get that current configuration realigned here, and we can still leverage the mass renewals utility to avoid manually renewing individual programs and special jobs. So again, don't worry if things aren't set up to be auto renew. We do have a few little tricks that we'll talk about in the mass renewals utility to still be able to renew everything. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at our settings, and then we're going to open up the service setup. So again, that's where we're really going to start looking at our options for aligning with best practices. So once we get to settings, and we can either scroll down to the service setup, or we can search using the search bar here, and that'll just kind of reduce our results and make that a little more present. Service setup here. Right, so again, very familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure. We won't really need to go over a lot of the service code description. What we're really worried about is down here at the bottom for our special jobs. For rounds of a program, we're not going to have this lower section, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We're going to define the automatic renew for a program under program setup. Right, so the big one we're looking at here is going to be that automatic renew. So again, if this is a service that should be renewed year over year, running that mass renewals utility, or again, a continuous service type job, then we would want to make sure that automatic renew is selected. And conversely, if this is that job that we spoke about where it's going to be added as needed, then we would not want to have that automatic renew. Again, it's really best practices to configure these to what they need to be. So not selecting automatic renew for everything is just as bad as selecting automatic renew for everything. So you want to just make sure we're taking a look and getting these services set up the way they really should be according to how your company operates. Right. All right, so now let's take a look at, again, we see one that's set up with automatic renew. We can take a look at one that is not automatic renew. And we'll talk about this once we get to the mass renewals utility, right? So there's that automatic renew not selected where it likely should be. And it is really just a matter of checking that box and clicking save. All right, so the next area of the software, again, we're going to talk about the program setup. So when we're dealing with rounds in a program that are not configured correctly, I mentioned that there, it's not going to have our option for settings down here at the bottom. Again, these settings are managed by the program. So we can see here, I can't make that selection for automatic renew. So I need to head over to our program setup. We'll jump into settings here. Again, we can search. It's just going to reduce those results, making it a little bit easier to find. Then we'll open up our program setup. All right, so we can see here that I have that auto renew program mistake round in an auto renew program mistake program. And our setting here for automatic renew is what we need to specify to automatically renew that program, and then any subsequent rounds that are contained in that program as well. So that's where we would make that change for any programs. And again, we'll touch a little bit more on this once we get into the mass renewals utility, but this is where we're going to go to verify that things are set up correctly and to make sure that we are aligning with, again, best practices, so just to make this process in the future that much easier on everyone. All right, so now that we've taken a look at the different areas of the software that will reflect our renewals and really impact our renewal process, we've taken a look now at aligning those best practices. Let's head back to the main page of Service Assistant, and then I'm just going to take everybody through the process of running through renewals, right? We'll make this a quick, just so you get an idea of really what that process looks like, and then we'll delve deep into our different configurations that we have in that mass renewals utility. I just kind of want you to see that the renewals process is something that we're going to run year over year, and I just want everybody to be comfortable with what that looks like. So here we'll head back into our menu, jumping back to utilities. I'm going to scroll down, and just like with settings, we can search this page using that search at the top. And I'm going to click on that mass renewals. Right, so here are options, and the first thing you're probably going to notice right away is this: make a backup of your data before proceeding. For all Service Assistant 5 users, this isn't something that you need to reach out to the support team and request any longer. Our process now is to back up your data throughout the day to avoid the need for waiting for support to respond to a backup. So you can actually ignore that warning entirely and just move on with your renewals. So we're going to make our branch selected. So again, we can process renewals by all branches, or we can filter individual branches and do smaller renewal batches. And that way we can validate that information in a smaller subset. We're going to select the current year to renew. So again, that's just the season we're renewing jobs from, and then that will renew into the following season. If we are assigning renewal date ranges, or renewal dates rather, to programs and jobs, we can filter the renewals by that renewal date range, but generally something like all is going to be the method we'll see used here. Below this is going to be the listing of jobs that we have available to our customers. And we can see here, by default, any job that is not marked auto renew is not selected. And by default, any job that is configured as automatic renew or auto renew is selected from this list, right? So I mentioned it earlier, just because it's not configured for auto renew does not mean we can't leverage this utility to process through it. All right, so then we have some configuration options. Again, we're going to go over this in a lot more detail here momentarily, but we just have our configuration selections, what we want to do with the data as it's renewed, and then we have some options for what we're going to do with any sort of a date that's applied, filters, call log options, and then we can click on process renewals. So again, any jobs we have selected here, by default, we can renew that quickly. So we'll just click on process renewals. The system's going to go through, it's going to process those renewals. There is an option to display a renewal summary, which is what's showing up here, giving us an overview of the services and jobs that were renewed. And then we're going to get a total count. Again, just another way for us to validate the information that was processed through that mass renewals utility. Right, so that is going to be the process of running renewals, right? It's actually a pretty straightforward process. The trick is really to get that data aligned with best practices to make it that simple. All right, so now that we've gone through and you see what that looks like, now let's dig a little bit deeper into what our options and our configurations here on this page are. So again, we talked about the branch selector, the year we're going to renew, renewal date range, and then we get into the program and job listing here. So we do have some additional options. So again, we have these selected by default, any jobs that are set up to auto renew. But we also have this column renew as. So what the software allows you to do, if we're going to retire a program or a job and replace it with a new program or job, what we can do is select the program or job that the previous season should renew as. So if we're retiring a specific job that was configured with a specific chemical set or a method of how we're going to perform that job, and we don't want to modify history, right? We don't want to update program code names, service code names, because that's going to impact the history data, and it's going to look like we've always been providing this job. So again, best practice here is to create a new program or special job to renew into or renew as. And this is where we make that selection. Right? We can also change statuses. So if you're in an area that requires that you get a contract signature or some sort of an authorization from each customer who you'll be providing jobs for, then what you can do during that renewal process is you can change that into a different status. By default, an active job in season 2021, for example, will be an active job in 2022. If we need to modify that, then we can change that, changing it either to a no status if we're going to go through the process of, getting our prepaid letters if those are going to serve as our contract, or whatever method we're going to use to get that approval from the customer. And then next to that, we have the scheduled start. So when we're dealing with dates, and especially our repeating services, so that's going to be any service that we're going to go out and perform the same service over and over again, right? This might be an outdoor pest spray. This might be an indoor pest monitoring service. This might be a mowing service, anything like that, that we're just going to be doing the same thing on each visit. And normally that's going to repeat at some frequency, either weekly, monthly, quarterly, etc. We need to make sure that we're defining a start date. If we do not define a start date on repeating services, and again, we'll cover this in a moment here, and we build the schedule for repeats, it's going to start that first date on January 1 of the following year. So again, a very important part. And one of the things I do like to recommend is actually running these repeating specials as a separate batch. So again, just because it's selected here by default does not mean we have to just agree that we're going to run that right now. It might be a good idea, again, for any repeating specials to run those as a separate job. And for the non-repeating specials, we can just go ahead and deselect that build schedule, right? That's going to prevent the system from building out all of the visits in a given special job. If we're using something like a special job that we're setting a max to, and let's just take a quick look at that. So if we're setting a max number here in the top right in our scheduling section, but we don't want to build out each visit, then we don't build schedule, right? It'll just, once we complete work for one job, it's going to add a second visit for us to then pull through the invoicing process. And so if we are using a combination of those setting the max but not building and building for repeating specials, we will want to run those build schedules in a separate batch. Just a good tip there. All right. Next, we have our only complete. So this is going to allow us to only renew jobs that are complete. So those programs that are completed, all visits in or the minimum number to complete for any repeating specials. So we can filter out using that method as well. On the right here, this is just the unique program ID associated with the program or job name, is what that is. All right, below this list, we now have our different configurations for that renewals. So we have an option that allows us to change the source. So this is going to be that program or job source code, right? If we need to change that or desire to change that, we can click on change source, and then we're just going to select that different source. Now, these options are really going to be specific to how your company wants to handle that. There is no default or really a recommendation here. You can change that source if you desire, selecting maybe existing customer if that's how you wish to handle that. You know, I prefer to leave something like a source as is. That way, running reports against information, we don't have to constantly go back to previous service years to identify how a customer heard about a specific program or job. But again, some customers do like to change that source to existing customer or something similar. We have our option to renew, target, or preconditions. So if we talk about that, that's going to be found under the, again, the program details and then the service by expanding that service row. And we have our preconditions. So if we've configured preconditions or targets on a customer's job or service, generally, we're going to want to renew that season over season. And that's why by default, the renew target preconditions is going to be selected. But if you do not want to renew those, it's as simple as unchecking that checkbox. Up next is going to be our clear sold date and salesperson. So selecting, again, this one is not selected by default when you open up the renewal utility. This is one you'll need to make a determination if that's something you want to do. And what that will do is literally remove the sold date and the salesperson from our sales details on that renewed program or job. Right? So again, perhaps beneficial if we are needing to get that customer approval before beginning services and we're going to renew into an estimate status. Well, then maybe we will want to update that sold date and salesperson as we get that approval. The reset man-hour rate to default. So what that's going to do is that's going to take any of our man-hour rate jobs and it's going to reset to the default that's found under service setup. Right? So if we jump back to our settings really quickly here, we'll take a look at that. Scrolling down here, so if we have a job that's configured for man-hour and we have that man-hour rate, what that's referring to is resetting back to that rate. So it's going to override whatever that man-hour rate is that's been configured on the customer's service row. Right? So if we scroll back up through this and scroll across, we'll have our option for that man-hour rate. So resetting to default is going to override what's here and then configure it for the service setup configuration. So that method can be used as a means to increase prices on your man-hour rate jobs if you wanted to use it as that. You can change those jobs, you can change that rate, and then for all of your renewed services, you would reset to default and it would look at that service setup instead of what the customer had in the previous year. So a little trick there. Next, we have the clear promised. So again, looking back at that customer's program details page, what we're talking about there is really just that promised checkbox. So if it's promised in 2021, should it really be promised in 2022 A lot of times that's going to align with dates, scheduled times, and more often than not, we're not going to make that same promise at the beginning of the season and that commitment to that customer for that to happen at some point during the season. And that is why that clear promise is selected by default. That mass renewal summary that we saw, and when I process those renewals, that's going to be based off of this checkbox. Again, generally recommended to just go ahead and leave that selected. And when that runs and it pops up, just like everything in Service Assistant 5, we have an opportunity to print that, but we don't have to. Again, we can just use that to validate information. Maybe we're going to run a season summary report following that checklist after we process our renewals, and we just want to make sure that that number we see in that report aligns with what we see in the renewal summary. Right? So just a way to validate that information a little bit more closely. Up here, now we have the remove association codes. What this is talking about is manually associated services. So again, I'm going to pop back into that program details. With the service row expanded, we have our associations, and this is where we can select other services on the customer's account that are going to be associated, and we can pull those through the invoicing process. They're going to appear on the same printed invoice, or if we're emailing the Service Assistant invoices, it's going to show there. They're also, when associated, going to appear on that same after service email through AMA. So if we've gone through all of the work to manually associate services, generally you want to keep those associations the same in the following year. And that is why, by default, remove association codes is not selected. But again, if you've decided as part of your operations that you want to remove those and reassociate manually after the renewals, we'll just want to check that box to remove those associations. Up next is going to be our move estimates to the new service year. So I want you to take particular note at the word move, right? Earlier we spoke about the renewals. That's going to copy the jobs from season to season. This selection here is actually going to move those. So if we have a job on a customer's account or a program on the account that is an estimate status, this will actually take it out of 2021 and move it to 2022, right? So this is actually going to take that job out of that season, the current season, and move it over to the next. A little bit of a different behavior for that estimates. And again, by default, the renewal process is really only going to look at our actives. It's this selection here that allows us to take a look at our estimates and move them to the next service year. Up next is our reset auto renew settings to default. So I'm actually going to skip over this one for just a moment, and we're going to come back to that because this is how we're going to help align and use some of those changes to the automatic renew that we talked about and get things set up and prepared for all of our future renewals. So give me a moment, we'll jump back to that one here in just a second, as it kind of aligns with one of our future options. Build schedule for repeating. Again, we touched on that. If we're renewing repeating specials and we want that repeat to be built out, that schedule to be built out, so visit 1 through 20, whatever it happens to be for a given season, we're going to need to select that build schedule for repeating. Very important here, because building schedule after renewals for repeating services, that should be, there isn't an option, there isn't a utility that's just going to go through. This is our chance. So when renewing those repeating specials that should have the schedule built, we'll want to make sure that we do select that build schedule for repeating. And again, recommendation here is to just run those types of services as a separate batch. So we'll process these ones and then we'll come back and process that one. Reset confirmation letter settings to default. And again, this is going to reference the information on the program details page. And what we're talking about is that confirmation letter and the default selection under service setup. Next up, we have our a little bit of filters and some additional options here. So we can filter what we're going to renew by that customer type, looking at both or only residential, only commercial. Again, this just gives you an opportunity to to process your renewals in batches, maybe we're going to assign the responsibility of validating and running reports to different members of the team. And maybe we have somebody that's going to be focusing on our residential, somebody that's going to be focusing on our commercial, and we'll want to process those as separate batch and get that renewal summary over to the appropriate team member. To the right of that, we have our full and partial. So we have the option again to filter out by programs that are full and partial programs, full programs and jobs only. Right? So again, what we defined as a full program, and then partial programs only or jobs only there. So we can filter that out. Again, most commonly, what we're seeing here is going to be our default. So we're going to renew both that full and partial. By default, we're going to renew both commercial and residential accounts. Up next, we're going to talk about the diagrammed and linked docs. So this is going to be another element that's going to give us an option to move to the renewal. So I want everybody to think about where we see diagrams and documents. So most commonly, what we're talking about when we're dealing with linked documents on a customer's account, that's going to be our documents option here in Service Assistant 5. What the renewals utility is talking about is the option to move or copy any diagrams that were created with the diagramming tool, here, accessible using the 3 dots there. That's going to then move by default any diagrams that are associated that way or were created that way from the 2021 job to the 2022. Our options here, we can copy them, so we can leave that diagram and diagrams and docs associated with the individual special job or program and copy that over to the next season. Or we can do nothing, leaving it in the previous season and not carrying that diagram or document forward. Right? By default, we're going to move that information. It seems like it's something that's likely going to carry over. A lot of times this is going to, especially for a diagram, maybe mapping out the where on the property, how we should be navigating that customer's property to perform that service, something along those lines. So they're persistent with the service that needs to be done year over year. So moving it with the renewal makes sense. When we're dealing with our work order jobs, we have a couple of options here, and price by previous price is going to be our default. And what that means is that all work orders that are renewed are going to price by the price configured on the products in the current or previous season. Right? We do have an option here to price by product price, and very similar to what I spoke about, the option to reset man-hour rate to default, using that as a mechanism to modify pricing. You could do something like that as well for your work orders. So if you set this to by product price, and you've modified your product pricing under inventory adjustment, the renewed work order will have that updated price. Right? By default, we're going to use that previous price again, primarily because if we're renewing a work order job, that pricing is somewhat discussed and we want to honor that year over year. But again, we do have an option available to you. Up next is going to be our notes selection. So by default, we are going to remove any notes inside of curly braces. So that's going to be fun. You know, if we on our keyboard next to the P, we should have those 2 bracket keys, one of which is going to be the curly braces, and we can treat any notes in there as temporary. Maybe that's a this season only type note. That could be something, maybe the customer is going to be out of town for the month of June and they don't want their services performed. Maybe they're having somebody stay with them that has a sensitivity to a specific chemical. Again, this season only type of a note, we can treat that as temporary. And by default, remove any that are inside curly braces. Our options here are to remove any notes outside of curly braces, right? So this is going to be the inverse. So if we're making notes and we want to treat any notes that are inside of curly braces as permanent and anything outside of those as temporary, then we would select remove notes outside of curly braces. Our final option here is do nothing. So if we are using curly braces in a manner in the software that maybe doesn't align with either of these, right? Maybe it's just something we're using internally and we don't want to remove any notes, or if we're just unsure, maybe I don't know. I have a team member handling a lot of the office work. they might be using this, I'm not sure, then we can just do nothing, right? If we don't know and we want those notes to persist, selecting do nothing is just going to carry those notes forward, kind of a no harm, no impact type situation. Up next is going to be our reschedule for our non-repeating specials and programs. So if we're using the scheduled dates, how do we want to schedule a special job? Do we want to look at the same day of the week, which is going to be our default? If it was done on a Tuesday in 2021, that date will then be as close to that Tuesday in 2022. We can select the same date. So if we did the work on September 23rd in 2021, do we want that date to be September 23rd, 2022 for the following season? You know, one kind of just word of caution with this is that might put a scheduled date of a Sunday onto a customer's account. So that's a lot of the reason why default is going to be that same day of the week. Alternatively, we can clear that date entirely, right? So we can just say, I don't pull by scheduled date, I pull by last service date. I'm not overly concerned about the day of the week there, then you can clear that date. Again, having same day of the week does not impact your ability to use last service date in any way, so you don't have to select clear date in that regard. By default, our programs are going to clear those dates. Again, a lot of times and more often than not, our programs are going to be pulled by last service date. So that round is going to be pulled based off of when we performed the last round. So clearing that date is what's going to be by default. We can select same day of the week for those rounds, or we could even get into same date. So if we are scheduling with customers and we want that information to persist year over year, just make that selection and that will renew accordingly. Up next, we have our filter. Well, you know what, before we jump into that, I'm going to go back to a couple of things you probably noticed that I skipped. The services auto renew setting, and then we're going to talk about that auto renew settings to default. So I wait until we get through the rest of them because a little bit of a special attention here, right? So we have our options for services auto renew setting. So this is going to renew, it's going to serve as a filter, only renewing those services that on the program or job have the auto renew checkbox. That's going to be your default. Now, I spoke earlier about aligning with best practices, configuring our service setup to be auto renew, but when we do that, that doesn't change anything on our existing programs and special jobs. It's still going to be unchecked, even though we made that selection in service setup. That's going to be a future setting. But again, I did tell you that we could still renew all of those special jobs that should have been auto renew all along. And that's where our options from this checkbox come from. So if we click that drop down, we have services that default to auto renew, right? And that default is as of right now. So now that I've made that change under service setup, I've set that default to be auto renew for that program or special job. So again, aligning with those best practices. Now with this selection, I can still renew any of those special jobs that do not have, or programs that do not have the auto renew checkbox selected, right? It's a little bit of a way to get you back into that best practices and make this easier for next year. And when we do that, right? So in the future, we don't want to have to make that selection every time. And every time we come into this, it's going to carry in what we really make recommendations of, which for this setting is going to be services marked auto renew. So with that selection, I like to combine reset auto renew settings to default. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to renew those newly configured automatic renew services. And during the renewal process, it's going to set those programs and jobs to have that auto renew checkbox checked for the next season, right? It alleviates the need to then make that selection every year, right? Just making that process to run renewals really that much easier, that much more straightforward. We don't have to worry about, you know, these different little configurations. We get it done this year, we get things aligned with our best practices. And now it's as easy as coming in, setting up our batches as we need, again, renewing repeating specials recommended to be a separate batch. Verify our information, again, whatever our company practices are, and then clicking on that process renewals. So it definitely speeds things up in the future years to get things set up right now. And that's what changing this service setup or program setup and then using services that default and reset to default auto renew are used for, to help realign things for the future. All right. So now that we've touched on that, let's talk about our other filters. So for renewals, we can filter by flag codes. So again, it's important to note how the flag code functionality works when we're dealing with filters. So we have the with selection here. Any filter or any flag code we add to this row with will be treated as an or, right? So if we have a few different flag codes, maybe we have customer has pets, maybe we have a locked gate, maybe a customer requires to be present type of a flag code, and we want to renew only those customers that have that flag code. Okay, so then we'll add those to this list, and the system's going to say we're going to renew anybody that has flag code with a dog, or anybody that has a flag code of locked gate, and we're going to renew anybody that has a flag code of must be present, something like that. So it's really going to look at that. And if a customer has any one or all of those flag codes, it's going to renew them. It's not going to renew anybody that doesn't have one of those selected 3 flag codes, right? So each of those is its own unique or type statement. The same applies to running when we only have items in without, right? It's going to say, I'm going to renew anybody that doesn't have the dog, or I'm going to renew anybody that doesn't have locked gate, so on and so forth. So when we're using these separate, but with multiple flag codes in them, it's really just looking at that without or that with. Now, when we start combining these, right? So I want to renew customers with the dog flag code, but that do not have the locked gate, right? I'm getting a little bit more specific on our flag code filters here. That's going to be treated as an and the customer must meet both sets of criteria. So we talked about that. If we have multiple here, if they have any of them, if they have all of them, it's going to renew them. If we're putting information in the with and without sections, the customer must meet both sets of criteria. So in that previous example, the customer must have a dog flag code and must not have the must be present flag code, right? So it's going to combine those two, and the customer has to meet both criteria in order to be processed through renewals. So just again, it allows you to get pretty granular with those batches if you desire to. And finally, we have our call log options. Again, a lot of times this is going to be used by companies who are renewing as a different status. So, right, we're talking about renewing from an active into an estimate status, and we want to reach out to those customers. Maybe we have that sales team calling and we want to touch base with those customers. So we'll select our option to add a call log. From there, we'll just need to select our call status, right? So whether that's going to be a sales call, new call, renewal call, right? You can configure additional call statuses through settings. Who we're going to assign that to, right? So that's just that employee we're assigning to. The date that call and the time that that call is due to be completed by. And then we can select a contact status, right? So this is going to be a by default status that you're selecting is going to be kind of an outcome of that. And then any notes, right? So this any applicable notes, renewals processed, customer status 0, contact, and validate they would like to proceed in the next season, right? Really just any notes that's applicable to how you operate your business. Right? Below this, we have the option to, after processing, remain on the page. And then if you walk through that checklist, one of the next steps is going to be price increases, and then a following step is going to be our installment renewals. Again, you'll find more information on that as you go through that checklist. So we can either stay here, or if we know we're going to then go into our price increases, we can jump right into that utility after the renewals process there. By default, it's just going to stay on this page. And just like you saw before, we're going to process renewals. So that's going to renew those services again from the selected year into the next. So here, I'll just go ahead, since we renewed the 2021 already, I'm going to select 2022. It's going to renew my services into 2023 here. Again, process those renewals. System takes a few moments. Now, again, that does depend how many jobs we're renewing. So some of you might see this run a considerably longer amount of time if we're renewing thousands and thousands of jobs compared to just the few hundred here that I'm renewing. So it really does depend on your data. And that might be another good reason to run through in company branch batches, right? Just to reduce that set and speed things along for each set of data. Right, so there's that renewal summary we took a look at earlier. And that is going to be how we process renewals and your different options there. So again, one more time, just to kind of take you through that process, and I gave you a lot of information there, right? So there was a lot of details on what you can do, how we can align with best practices. I know that can be a little bit overwhelming at times. So I'm just going to put it together one more quick time for you, just so you remember that the process is actually pretty straightforward, unless we're trying to realign with those best practices. And then after that, it is actually quite simple. So again, we're going to go to our menu, utilities. I'm going to scroll down to our year-end section. Mass renewals. I'm not going to talk a lot about our options here. Again, I'm going to renew because again, I've already renewed these. I need to select a different year. So we'll select our year. Again, making our changes to however we want to renew based on our batch or repeating specials, whatever we want to achieve there. Selecting a start date as is applicable. I'm going to build the schedule for this type of a repeating job, validating again everything that aligns with your business needs. And then I'm going to click process renewals. System's going to go through. Just happen to not have any jobs to renew for that season there. So that would then process those renewals, build that repeating schedule for us, and that is now done. And we can move on to the next step in that year-end checklist. Right, so now that we've gone through that, right? So congratulations, right? If you've been following along, making selections, clicking on that process renewals, you've just successfully completed the mass renewals process and copied over your auto renew, or again, if we've realigned existing programs and jobs to the next season. Right? So remember to continue through that year-end checklist to ensure that everything you need is as configured, so that way you can continue providing that outstanding services to your existing customers and future customers. So now there's one more thing I want to touch base on. So we do have an option outside of the mass renewals utility to renew a single job for a customer, right? That's just going to be a single renewal. We're not renewing all customers that meet our criteria here. So let's jump back to a customer's account. And again, so from here, I'm going to renew one of these jobs into a future season, right? Again, we can see here that I've processed renewals a few times, so I do have data extending out pretty far. So I'm just going to renew, for example, this 2021 job into 2023. Right? Again, you would generally be renewing into the next season, but because we've clicked on process renewals a few times, I have to select a different year. To do that, we can click the three dots to the right of the program or job. And you know what, we renewed that one already, so let me select my 2022 here. And we renewed that already. So let's go ahead and go here. So I'm going to jump up to 2023, and then we have our renew service option. So the way I could tell that I couldn't renew was because that option was grayed out. So that tells me that the service is already renewed, and that checkbox on the program details, if I give it a quick refresh, we'll see that it says renewed, right? So that's going to prevent me from processing that renewal again. So again, so here on the later service here, we can click on renew service, and this screen is going to look fairly familiar to you, right? We're reducing our options to only this special job or this program. So we'll select our renew as that was going to be that column that we saw in the mass renewals utility. Now they're just simple drop-down selectors. So the year we're renewing into, right? So this is a little bit different than that mass renewals utility. The date we were selecting there was the current season. So again, in this example, 2021. For the single renewal, you are selecting the year you are renewing into, right? So that should generally be the next season or a season following is what you'll select for the year here. There's that status selector. Again, we can make that status selection in the mass renewals utility. Just a simple drop down here, and by default, it's going to carry forward the status that it's currently in. Modifying our source, whether or not we're going to move, copy, or do nothing with those diagrams and documents like we spoke about. Our work order options using previous price, price by product. What we're going to do with our notes, removing inside, removing outside, or again, that option that we can always safely bank on to do nothing. Renewing our preconditions, right? We get into that reset auto renew settings back to default. Removing association codes, resetting that confirmation letter setting, clearing our sold date and salesperson, and then reset back to man-hour rate default. And then we get into our scheduling, just like we saw previously. It's going to look at the, we have our start date. So when are we going to start? Like, very important for our repeating specials, just like we spoke about earlier. And then whether we're going to clear the schedule date, use the same date in the year, or the same day of the week option. So again, because this is a program, it's making that default clear schedule date selection for us. Clear promised. And then for repeating specials that we want to build the schedule for, build schedule. From there, just as simple as clicking process. So that is the process of running renewals using that mass renewals utility. Now, a nice feature that was recently added to the software. So let's just say we go through that mass renewals utility and we realize, looking at the renewal summary or running those reports in the year-end checklist, maybe a mistake was made. We do now have an option that you can go to utilities, and we're going to head back down to our year end. We have options now to undo renewals. Now there is some restrictions here. We can only renew or undo renewals that extend back a week from when we run those renewals. So we can't go back and undo renewals extending a great deal farther, primarily because we might see customers prepaying for services that were renewed. So that's why we try to restrict that. And again, it's important that we go through the checklist, that we go through the renewal summary, that we go through our reports and make sure that our data is accurate when we're, because we can jump to this renewal, and ideally we're catching that quickly and undoing a renewal from today, right? Or maybe it was yesterday. So really close to when we processed those renewals. We'll select the renewals run by, so the employee that ran the renewals. And then our option to remove is going to be both individual renewals, what we just talked about, and then the mass renewals that we had run through previously. All right, so if I were to click undo, this is then going to go through and undo all of those renewals that I processed. So not just the 2021 into 2022, not just the 2022 into 2023, and then that last individual renewal from 23 to 24. This is undoing all of those renewals that were processed today. And it's resetting that renewed checkbox on that 2021 service or program, so that is cleared and will allow us to once again process renewals, making any changes that we needed to correct whatever may have happened or was selected incorrectly during that process. All right, and that is going to be the end here of our webinar. I'll go ahead and see, is there any questions that came in, Chandra?
It looks like we had one question come in.
Sure.
So as you are renewing, let's say like a subset of those programs or services, like you mentioned, more batching it out by those different aspects, do they disappear from that chart, the programs and services, as you update them from year to year?
So
or do they stay there?
The job itself, and I just make sure that I'm kind of showing you what we're talking about. What I think we're talking about is our selections here in this table. So no, they do not disappear. However, even if you had it selected again, the renewed checkbox, once we've processed, is selected, meaning none of those jobs will renew again effectively, right? So we can only renew once because of that renewed checkbox that we talked about. And here, let me pull that back up. So this checkbox right here, which would be cleared if I were to refresh, but I had it open still. This box, once it's checked, it doesn't matter how many times I try to renew these services, it's not going to do it. So it doesn't remove it from the list, but it does prevent you from renewing it a second time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so no other questions came in. So what I would like to just quickly touch on is going to be if you think you need some additional assistance, right? So if maybe some of this, you still had some questions and you needed some assistance processing those renewals. When we're requesting that sort of a thing from our support team, we're actually going to have you fill out a renewal form, and then we'll get you scheduled for an appointment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and in the chat, I'm going to share with everybody here today the link to that form. So you should be seeing that here in just a second. So if we do need some help, we can click on that link and you can save that link. And that's then going to take you to a Google form. You'll fill the information out, right? So this is really going to take you through and ask you a lot of the questions that we just went through, right? We touched on all of these different options. It's going to ask you those very similar questions. Do we want to renew target preconditions? Do we want to remove association codes? You're going to make your selections there. You're going to then submit that form. That's going to go to our support team, and they're going to send you an invite to schedule your renewal appointment if you wanted somebody to take you through that process or assist with you. Now, again, if we just have a general question about what something does as part of these options, of course, you can send in a support request. If you're signed in to Service Assistant, we have the request technical support down here on the bottom. If we're not, we can always navigate to realgreen.com/tech-support. And then you can just ask your question here and submit that to the support team, and we'll get you those answers, answering the questions about what that field does, or maybe we're using something a little bit differently before we align to best practices. We just want to understand a little bit further what those outcomes are. Of course, just go ahead and get us a question submitted, and we'll get you those answers. And if no other questions, then I think that does conclude the webinar. Thank you everybody so much for attending today. I hope we were able to answer some questions, maybe reduce some of the nervousness around processing renewals. I know that that warning there about the backup can be a little intimidating, but like I mentioned earlier today, with changes in our process and how we're handling backups, you don't have to worry about that option anymore for our Service Assistant 5 users. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.